Hello, my name is Corey Dehart from Maryville High School. In this video, I will explain how standards-based grading will be used in my classroom. Let's begin by understanding what standards-based grading is. In standards-based grading, all assessment and learning is based on specific learning objectives and the student's proficiency in understanding those objectives. Each of these learning objectives are tied to specific standards that are in the course. So the learning objectives for my AP Physics class are tied to the standards for AP Physics that are passed down from the College Board. Students will receive a grade on each of these learning objectives, which are then used to find their final grade in the course. The first step in establishing standards-based grading in the classroom is to identify the learning objectives, and these should be written as I can statements. Here's an example of an AP Physics 1 standard from the College Board. This is a pretty complicated and difficult to understand standard, but when you break it down into these three learning objectives, it's something that a student can understand exactly what it is that is expected of them to do well on this standard. One question that people might have is, why use standards-based grading at all? Well, curriculum and instruction and the way we communicate have all changed since education has been formalized years ago. But one thing that has not changed has been grading. It's been the same for the past 150 years. Standards-based grading is a way to provide a more equitable and accurate method of grading for our students, and hopefully you'll see that by the end of this video. As we look at our traditional grading practices, here are some things to consider. First off, what does an 80 mean? How is that different from an 82 or a 79? Next, what about the excessive homework that we give students, especially those who work after school or practice for band or concert or a sports team, or those who volunteer after school? What is the exact meaning of participation grades or extra credit? What do these types of grades tell us about a student's understanding of the course? What about a student who finally understands something, but it's 2 weeks after the test and they don't have the opportunity to show that they understand it? And finally, why is 93 an A? Why not 92, 90? It's been actually different scores throughout the years and in different places. 70% passing is just a number that was decided upon years ago, and it's actually different in other parts of the world. So what are some of the benefits of standards-based grading? Well, first off, it provides meaning to grades. Every grade means something because it is tied to a specific learning objective. It means that student has mastered or is proficient or maybe still needs to study that specific learning objective. It keeps students and teachers accountable because the students know exactly what is expected of them to pass the class, and the teachers know exactly where the students are on each standard. They are both held more accountable. It provides better feedback for improvement. A big part of standards-based grading is increasing the amount of feedback students get for how they're doing on the various standards. It provides information to differentiate instruction. So students that are doing well on standards can continue learning. Those who need more help because they have not performed at a high enough level on certain learning objectives, they can get more help. Students become more self-motivated because they know that it's explicit right there what they need to do to improve for the class. I need to do better on this learning objective, but these three I have mastered. And it tracks mastery of the standards, so we are able to track exactly how a student is doing over the standards for the entire course. There are two types of assessment in standards-based grading, formative and summative. In formative assessment, it is used to guide the instruction and learning. It's not used to evaluate the student. Students don't get a grade that affects their final grade for the course. It provides feedback to both the student and the teacher, so the student knows how well they are doing and the teacher knows which students need further help. Formative assessment is often scored, but is not included in the final grades. Examples of formative assessment include teacher questioning during class discussions, classwork, homework, quizzes, some labs, and some group projects. Formative assessment is assessment for learning. It is not an assessment of the learning. As mentioned earlier, feedback is a very important part of standards-based grading. It's used to identify and close the gaps in student understanding and lets the students know exactly where they are. For example, let's look at this physics problem and see how feedback would be given under the traditional grading system and how it would be given under standards-based grading. Now, in this problem, I would be looking at the various things you see here to make sure that the student has all of the components to answer this problem. Here we have student 1, and we can see that for this student, they've pretty much answered the problem. If I was going to grade this on completion, I would say they got full points because they had something on the paper and I would have glanced at it and gave them credit. If I was grading them on correctness, they also would have gotten full points because both of their answers are correct. However, if I'd been grading this on standards-based grading, a closer look reveals that the student switched the horizontal and vertical solutions, and I would provide that feedback on their paper. Now they'll still get the same score, they'll still have it all the points, so they would have got a score of 4, which is the highest score you can get in standards-based grading, but they would have this extra feedback right here. Now let's take a look at a different student who did not do as well. For this student, they entered some stuff on the paper, and for completion grades, they would have probably gotten full points. But if I was grading for correctness, they would only gotten half the points because they got the first one correct, but they missed the second one. But for standard-based grading, the teacher provides a lot more feedback. Here you see that the teacher recommends that the student needs a diagram. They ask a question about where they got certain values. They did give them some good feedback talking about that they listed the equations. And then finally they went into detail about why they missed the problem. So for this student's work, the grade would only be a score of 2, which is below basic. Formative assessment is often scored on the same 1 to 4 scale as summative assessment, but those scores do not go in as a grade. So what about homework then? Is it required if it's not getting a score on it? Well, no, it's not required, but as you'll see a little bit later on, it's very, very important that the students do their homework. And what about quizzes and classwork? While they're not required, it would look fairly poor if a student was not working on the work that we have in class or taking the quizzes that we have in class. So those things, while they're not technically required, I will expect the students to do them. Unlike formative assessments, summative assessments do count for the student's grade. Examples of these include unit tests, labs, and special projects. Usually a test will cover several learning objectives, maybe as many as 4. And each test will have a score for each learning objective. So a summative assessment will have several scores with it. These scores will range from 1 to 4 according to the following. 1 is below basic, 2 is basic, 3 is proficient. Proficient means that they are doing well enough in the course to move on. And 4 is mastery, to show that they have excelled at the learning objective. Let's look at a sample summative assessment to get a better idea of how these things work. Here we have a student, John McLean, who took a test that had 4 learning objectives on it: designing experiments, writing equations, motion time graphs, and solving one-dimensional problems. And each one of those had 4 questions each, for a total of 16 questions. You can see the scores that John got. He got a total of 13 correct out of 16, which would be an 81% or a C. But just having this number 81 written at the top of his test tells him nothing, and tells John's parents nothing about how they are doing in the course. It just says it's a C. Maybe they were really strong in some parts and very, very weak in others, or maybe it's just a constant C across the board. In contrast, the scores on the summative assessment in a standards-based grading would show that John has mastered the 3rd and 4th learning objective because he got a 4 and a 4 on each of those, but he still needs to work on the first learning objective. He only scored a 2. The 3rd one he's doing proficient on, so that's up to him whether he wants to pursue it further or not. When it comes to reassessment in standards-based grading, it's very lenient. Students can reassess on any learning objective they have not mastered. Any new higher scores replace the old lower scores, but if a student makes a lower score on the reassessment, you do not replace the previous score with a lower score. When they reassess, students don't have to retake the entire test, only those learning objectives that they have not scored high enough on. There are certain conditions for reassessment in my class. I think it is helpful to look at reassessment in standards-based grading as taking a driver's license. If you were to fail your driver's license test, that doesn't mean you never get to drive. It just means you go back and study and retake your driver's license test another day. In order to reassess a learning objectives, there are certain conditions that must be met. First, the student must submit a request to reassess. They have to ask to do the reassessment. I'm not going to force it upon them. Second, there needs to be some sort of plan to review for that learning objective. One thing for certain is that they will have to have completed all homework that has not previously been submitted. That's why, although homework is optional, it's very important that students do it the first time that it is assigned. That way they will have it ready for the reassessment if needed. Other things that they might have to do is they might have to complete another problem set or have a conversation with the teacher before or after school. In this conversation, the teacher and student would discuss any misunderstandings the student had about the learning objective. Students might also be asked to complete a study guide or watch an instructional video. Reassessments may be given during class, but more than likely they will take place before or after school, and they should take place within 2 weeks from the initial assessment. Reassessments may take a different form, but will address the same learning objective. And finally, even though a student may be reassessing on something from a previous unit, the instruction for the next units will continue. There will be a final exam for everyone, but every student's final exam may be different. The student's final exam will consist of problems covering learning objectives for which they've scored a 2 or lower. If they have scored a 3, then they may include that on their final exam if they wish. This will be the last chance to replace low scores, and obviously there are no reassessments after the final exam. It's important to explain how these standard-based grades get converted to letter grades. Scores from the summative assessments will be averaged. That average will then be converted into a number grade. Because this is an AP course, you will get an additional 5 points if you're taking the AP exam and 3 points if you're not taking the AP exam. Later in this video, I will explain how those additional points are added into your grade. Here is how the standards-based grades can be converted into the more traditional grades based on a 100-point scale. If a student scores perfect on every standard, they would have an average of 4, and that would be a grade of 100. If they're taking the AP exam, they would get 5 additional points added on for a grade of 105. As you can see here, if a student has an average of 3.4, that's a grade of 85. If they're taking the AP exam, 5 additional points will be added on, making their grade a 90, which is an A. One of the goals of standards-based grading is to get students and parents to stop thinking about the number being so important for the grade, and instead to be thinking about mastering the content that the student is trying to learn. Here is a much easier grading scale that students and parents can use to think about the grades that they will earn in my class. Notice that the students taking the AP exam have a slightly different grading scale because they get an extra 0.2 points because they are taking the exam. Because the grade of A indicates a mastery of the subject matter, there are special conditions to earn an A. First, the student's grade must be a 93 or higher, and the student cannot have more than 20% of scores of 2, or they can have no scores of 1 recorded for any learning objective. Otherwise, that grade will be a B+. This has to do with me certifying that the student has mastered AP Physics, not just mastered part of it and done poorly on another part. I'll explain more of this a little bit later in the video. To understand this a little bit better, let's look at some hypothetical grades. Here we have 4 students along with the scores they made on 10 learning objectives, and their average is down at the bottom. Here we can see that Evan made a 3.1, Jonah made a 3.4, Carrie had an average of 3.8, and Karen had an average of 2.6. If we now look at their grades in context with whether or not they took the AP exam, we can see that the first 3 students who took the AP exam had their converted scores go up by 5 points, from an 86 to a 91, an 89 to a 94, and a 93 to a 98. But Karen did not take the exam, so her score only went up by 3 points to an 84. And at the bottom you can see the grades for each of the students. Evan made a B+, Jonah made a B+, Carrie made an A+, and Karen made a C+. But you might ask, what about Jonah? According to his score, he had a 94, and that should be an A. But if you recall, you cannot have a 1 or lower on any of the learning objectives in order to get an A. And Jonah scored a 1 on learning objective 4, which means he could not score an A in AP Physics. Perhaps we should think about this like an airline pilot. Here we have an imaginary airline pilot who had to learn 4 things to become a pilot: taking off, flying, navigating, and landing. Now you see that our pilot did great on taking off, flying, and navigating, but not so well on the landing. While his score would have been a 93, which is an A, you would not say that this person has mastered being a pilot. I hope this video has explained how standards-based grading will be used in my classroom. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at my email address.